Hello and welcome to another Victoria 3 developer diary video. Again, a little bit later than maybe some other channels that cover the dev diaries because we like to get the dev comments in. And yeah, I did ask people about that, and the overwhelming majority said they preferred to have the dev comments in, so we're going to continue doing it this way. But anyway, today's topic is rather heavy. Very, very heavy, in fact. As you can see, we've got this lovely is the word lovely? Whatever. We've got the background image of today's dev diary, and there it looks like maybe the rebellion in Haiti, perhaps, because today's dev diary is all about slavery and enslaved people. So let's move on to the Twitter teaser first of all, and there it is. This week's dev diary is going to cover how slavery and enslaved people are represented in the mechanics of Vicky 3. Here's a look at the institution of slavery in the United States in 1836, which historically ended up as the primary catalyst of the Civil War. This is objectively true. We're not going to be debating that here, of course. I do think there are going to be people who will want to debate that. It is still a contentious issue in the United States. But yeah, it's nice to see where Martin's, lines in the sand are, I guess. But anyway, let's have a look at the image. We can just see the state of Virginia. Buildings in Virginia either utilize slaves or have the potential to utilize them. Lovely. Very, very straightforward, to the point. That's what a slave state is. Use slaves or can use slaves. There's also been people who have pointed out that the American flag here has a different amount of stars compared to other images that we have seen. Now, I haven't got an image of that ready for us, but I have seen them side by side, and yes, there are multiple American flags based on, I assume, how many states there are. So that is nice to see that the flags are updating in that kind of real time. Potentially even more so than we saw in Victoria 2, which had a just ridiculous amount of potential flags. But yeah, with that out of the way, let us get into the dev diary proper. We're going to be talking about slavery. So, yeah, heavy topic. Let's see how Paradox handles this one then. It's Thursday again. Well, I mean, we've already gone over that. Which means it's time for another Victoria 3 developer diary. Today's subject of slavery is a rather heavy one, being both one of the most significant political issues of the Victorian era, as well as a story of untold suffering on a human level. For this reason, before I start going into the mechanics of slavery, I want to briefly explain our philosophy behind its representation in Victoria 3. Slavery is obviously a horrific crime against humanity, and precisely for this reason many games that have a slavery-related setting or mechanics will either leave it out of the game or abstract it into something less on the nose, for example by simply applying some form of economic bonus at the expense of decreased stability. For Victoria 3, we don't think these options work for us for two main reasons. Is this maybe a little bit of a jab at other Paradox games? EU4 has slavery, technically. EU4 has certain provinces that have a slave trade good, which just sounds horrific, really, let's be honest. And yeah, that is an economic bonus. I don't even think, there was no decreased stability by having slaves in EU4, so it's even, it's the economic bonus without the expense. Is that not even worse? Stellaris has slavery, but in fairness, you can enslave aliens, so I don't think that really counts. CK, does that have slavery? I don't think it does. Not as far as I can tell. I mean, you can imprison people and, make them your concubines, and that's very iffy, but I don't know. Is it like poking at other games? I mean, even Victoria 2, right? The way Victoria 2 worked is you had a slavery pop type, and they sucked. It was not valuable to have them because slaves were basically untapped taxation potential. So you get rid of slavery ASAP, and now you can tax so much more of your population and you make more money. It's I guess the difference here is what is beneficial to the state versus what is beneficial to the people who live in the state. right? Because we've seen that in Victoria 3 already. Certain things have economic bonuses for certain groups over others. If the price of bread is high, that's bad for the pops that want to buy the bread, but for the people who have the bread, that's good. Like, there is no definitive, this is the best price, right? I think that's going to be, probably the same case with slavery, right? Slavery, really bad for the government, really bad for the state, because that is potential taxpayers that are not being taxed. But for the, say, plantation owners, slaves, fucking great. That's a soundbite. No. Because it is people that are working for you that you don't have to pay. I mean, it's Amazon's wet fucking dream. And so, yeah, it's going to be that kind of way again, I think. Certain things, slavery in this case, instead of the price of bread, are beneficial to certain groups over others. Obviously, the group of people, other than the state here, that lose out in the case of slavery are the slaves themselves. But yeah, I imagine, I haven't read this yet, but I imagine that's where we're going. So, the first reason, that we're talking about why Victoria 3 doesn't do slaves in an abstract way. First reason is that, as I mentioned before, it was an important political issue of the day, and was a major catalyst for several major conflicts, notably the American Civil War, which would be bizarrely contextless if slavery did not play a significant role in the game. The other and more important reason is that all through our pop system, we're trying to represent every individual human on the planet from 1836. So what statement would we be making if we simply wrote off all enslaved individuals out of history, or reduce them to an abstract set of modifiers? Yeah, totally agree. While the slave owners may have seen these people as trade goods, they were still people, right? So it absolutely makes sense. If you're trying to represent every single person on the planet, they're people. They're not trade goods. Paradox is not a plantation owner that sees these people as trade goods, So it makes sense. Reasonable reasons, as long as it's, handled with tact and do it justice, Don't make it so that slavery is, super rewarding. Make it realistic. Because slavery wasn't super rewarding. And yeah, it was a massively important political issue. For example, I'm more familiar with British history than American history, but I can tell you that in British history, Britain spent an obscene amount of money in funding the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron, which, among other things, stopped the Atlantic Triangle trade. That was we were the catalyst for stopping the slave trade. And Britain has done some horrific things in its history, but that is one thing that British people can be our country did that, and we're fucking proud of them for it. And I am. To the point, the amount of money that Britain spent on this anti-slavery policy is enough such that British people living in, I think, when did we pay it off? It was either the mid-90s or the mid-noughties. British people paying taxes were still paying off that debt. So, we did pretty good there. It is an important political issue, for damn sure. It was before 1836 that Britain outlawed slavery, but we're still fighting off slavers in 1836, so it makes sense to keep it there as, an important political issue. Anyway, moving on. Bit of a little ramble rant there. My apologies. So, instead, our aim is to try and represent this institution, systems, and causes of slavery, as well as the people who lived under and fought against it, as close to history as we can get it. We simply believe this to be the most respectful way for us to handle the topic, as well as the way that's most true to the game Victoria 3 aspires to be. With that said, let's get into the actual mechanic of how slavery and slave pops function in Victoria 3. As was mentioned in the Employment and Qualifications Dev Diary, slaves are what Victoria 2 would have called a pop type, and Victoria 3 calls a profession. but function in a significantly different way from other pops. For one, slaves do not get hired with the enticement of a wage and do not have the freedom to choose the place in which they work. Slaves also aren't just able to stop being slaves by switching their profession to one that does offer a wage and freedom of movement. And so we have slaves here. These slaves are given the bare minimum of goods to not starve, resulting in a very slight population increase over time, but generally a miserable existence for the people who make up the pop. And yeah, we have a couple of struggling Afro-Caribbean Catholic slaves in Cuba. Okay. 16,000 of them, growing at 99 either a week or a month, I'm not sure. 8,000 of them part of the workforce, 8,000 of them are dependents. And yeah. Okie dokie. Buildings that employ slaves also do so in a way that differs from the way they employ other professions. The gist of how this works is that in a state that has slaves, certain buildings, for example plantations, that employ labourers or peasants can fill each available position for those professions with either a labourer or peasant or a slave. As an example, a cotton plantation in a slave state that has the capacity to employ 4,000 labourers could fill that capacity with 2,240 slaves and 1,760 labourers, 4,000 labourers and 0 slaves, or any other combination of the two less or equal to 4,000. Generally, buildings will prefer acquiring slaves over hiring free labourers wherever possible for the economic benefits that it brings. Again, it is economically beneficial to the plantation itself, to the country, and to the slave pops. Obviously not beneficial. So what are those economic benefits? Well, first, it should be understood that said economic benefits are mostly for the owners of the building, meaning a bunch of wealthy aristocrats in the case of cotton plantations. Instead of paying wages, each building decides a standard of living based on factors such as laws and profitability and purchases the necessary goods for that target standard of living. This target standard of living may not always be at the level of outright starvation, but it is never going to be anything but a very basic existence. The cost to purchase said goods is simply added as a building expense and is virtually always going to be cheaper than employing paid labour, which translates into lower costs, higher profits, and increased dividends for the building owners. Slaves also do not pay taxes in any form, so if the government wants to convert those profits into revenue, they have to do so through the various forms of wealth-based taxes that are always going to be deeply unpopular with the powerful elite. Exactly like I said, which is perfect for me. It makes me look like a genius. So these tobacco plantations in Cuba have fully replaced the usual labour workforce with slaves instead, leading to a greater wealth for the aristocrats. This is tobacco plantations building in Cuba, and we've got, slaves replacing labourers, 8,000 of them. There's some farmers still, so it's not completely replaced. But yeah, that is, 13 is impoverished, and struggling is less than half of that, so yeah, it's not a very good existence for the slaves, for sure. And then I believe there are some laborers, maybe? Oh no, fully replaced by slaves, never mind. But yeah, actually, it's laborers and peasants. Farmers are a different one entirely, they're still apparently needed. However, there is one economic advantage to slavery that goes a little beyond just enriching aristocrats. Slave pops have a higher ratio of workforce to dependents than other pops, meaning that a population of 100,000 slaves can supply the labour needs of a greater number of buildings than a population of 100,000 labourers. The key thing here is, of course, that not all buildings can utilise slaves, so that it isn't going to be doing any good for an industrialised manufacturing economy, but a country that aims to keep its economy agriculture or plantation focused and suffers from a labour shortage may find the brutal economics of slavery to work in its favour if they're willing to stomach the human cost and can stamp down on any resistance. Yeah, that's fair. Slavery, if you think about the United States, the reason that the South was so into slavery is because they had a agriculture plantation focused economy. Whereas the North was industrialized way more. The biggest part of the reason that they won in the end was that the North was industrial. And that is generally better when you need to make guns and bullets and, spend for a war effort. But yeah, that's entirely fair. So, what kind of resistance are we going to get? Given that slavery is founded entirely on human misery, slaves are naturally not going to be content with their lot in life and will attempt to resist by whatever means are available to them. Mechanically, this translates into a steady stream of radicalized slaves and the threat of turmoil and slave uprisings. This threat to a slave society can usually be averted with sufficiently repressive measures, but fear and violence is not a good foundation for a completely stable country. Of course, resistance to slavery doesn't just come from the slaves themselves, but also from abolitionists, both internally in your country in the form of characters and interest groups with the abolitionist ideology, and externally in the form of abolitionist-led countries that may hinder or put pressure on slave regimes that aren't strong enough to resist them. The most notable historical example here being Britain, and its naval efforts, to stamp out the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. It's good being vindicated. Yeah, you really should look up the West Africa Squadron. It's fucking fascinating. With that explanation out of the way, let's talk about slavery laws. Actually, before we do that, if Britain has the abolitionist government in power and is like, you probably should stop with the slavery, you probably should, listen to them, because in Victoria 2, and I would assume Victoria 3, and also historically, in this time period, Britain's ridiculously fucking strong. Strongest country in the world, by far. Pretty comfortable to shit on anyone that's disagreeing with them. Probably should listen to Britain, and just, quit with the, human suffering industry. Probably a good idea. So let's talk about slavery laws. These are what govern who, if anyone, is enslaved or emancipated, and where, if anywhere, slavery can exist in your country. These are as follows. So we've got slavery abolished, the law that most countries with advanced economies start with. Under this law, slavery is completely illegal, and on its passage, any slave pops in the country are immediately emancipated and converted into labourers. If a country with this law comes into possession of land where slaves are living, said slaves are also immediately emancipated as above. We have debt slavery. This law is meant to represent traditional systems of generally debt-based slavery, present in a number of economically less advanced or decentralized countries. Under debt slavery, pops of low wealth levels will gradually create a trickle of new slaves, with poorer pops converting into slaves at a higher rate, as individuals sell themselves or others into slavery for economic reasons such as debt repayment. However, under this system, children born to slaves are born free, so slave populations will not grow by themselves. We have the slave trade. This law is meant to represent the kind of widespread chattel slavery practiced in places such as Brazil and Cuba. Under the slave trade, children of slaves are born as slaves, and new slaves can also be imported from abroad. We'll not go over exactly how slave import works today, but the gist of it is that slaves can be imported from decentralized countries that practice slavery if the importer has established interest in the region. More on interest at a later point. Interesting. Literally. We haven't really heard anything about interests yet, on a country level, for sure. And then we have legacy slavery. This law is meant to represent countries that have made the slave trade illegal, but not abolished it altogether, most notably the USA. Under legacy slavery, the country is divided into free states and slave states. In free states, slavery is illegal, and everything functions exactly as if the country had the slavery abolished law, while slave states function as though they had the slave trade law, with the notable exception that new slaves cannot be imported from abroad. Under this law, slaves also tend to have a slightly higher standard of living, for the simple reason that a starting slave population isn't demographically sustainable. This law also plays an important role in how the American Civil War functions in the game, but that's a topic for a later dev diary. It's going to be very interesting to learn about how that is going to fire. So USA starts the game with legacy slavery. Surely nothing will go wrong if they start trying to abolish it right away. We'll see. Slavery banned there, debt slavery, slave trade, and legacy slavery. Man, that is a fucking depressing image, is it not? That's fucking awful. Actually fucking awful. It genuinely makes me feel emotional. Anyway, moving on. Since slavery laws function just like any other laws, it's possible for them to change in different ways. A country with slave trade may follow the USA example and change to legacy slavery as a compromise alternative to abolishing it altogether, and a country that has fully abolished slavery can even try to bring it back. Given that no country in history actually legalized chattel slavery after abolishing it, this is a very difficult thing to do. Once abolished, there will generally be a strong anti-slavery bastion in a country that aren't going to look kindly on such proposals. Of course, trying to abolish slavery isn't likely to happen without resistance either. Those wealthy aristocrats who benefited from it have a vested interest in defending it after all. And then we have Lyman Beecha, leader of the devout interest group in the USA, is an ardent opponent of slavery. And this guy is actually historically a real person as well. I did look him up, and he do be a real person, which is it's cool to have that. It's cool to have that for sure. And he is an abolitionist, stands on slavery, strongly disapproves of debt slavery and slave trade, disapproves of legacy slavery, and strongly approves of slavery banned. He disapproves of serfdom, neutral towards workers' protections, regulatory bodies, and serfdom abolished. Good for him. So this is also very interesting because it shows that there are, other than the leaders of countries, it shows that there are historic characters in the game. Lyman Beecha being one of them, clearly. And it'll be interesting to see what other kind of characters pop up as the leader of other interest groups. I'm looking forward to finding out. On that note, we've reached the end of the dev diary, though we'll return a bit on this topic in the future when we talk about diplomacy, which isn't that far away now. Nice. Probably diplomacy on, you should stop having slaves. No, or yes, and that'll be the diplomacy. Next week, we're going to go over the system of states and the related mechanics such as state regions, split states, and turmoil. Split states is going to be also very interesting. Finding out how that works is going to be awesome. But before we do that, we are obviously going to be having a look at the developer comments, which I can show right now. There we go. It's so amazing that diplomacy is near. Yes, I am in full agreement there with Al-Khalidi. I was dying to see it. Just one question about slaves. I see proposed mechanics very well portrays laws and functioning of slaves in the New World. How about the Islamic world? Slavery was very widespread there, and slaves should perhaps be mostly treated as servants in wealthy houses. Also, will the Ottomans have slavery? In Vic 2, they had it abolished, which I think isn't entirely historically accurate, as the slave trade was present in the Ottoman Empire till at least the 50s, probably 1850s, and slavery was functioning somehow, in fact, till the collapse of the empire. Which slavery law would the Ottomans get? So, Islamic countries are a mixed bag. Some have debt slavery, some have slave trade, and some have banned slavery. The Ottoman Empire starts with the slave trade, the full hog. Okay, fair enough. Will there be an internal slave trade in legacy slavery countries? Will slaves have a price? I think this would help to capture a lot of the dynamics around the expansion of slavery. Virginia plantation owners, whose soil had mostly depleted, it's not a mechanic in the game. How do we know that that's not a mechanic in the game? Had a strong economic interest in expansion because it kept the price of slaves high and thus allowed them to maintain their lifestyle by selling slaves to planters on fresh cotton soil. So there will not be an internal slave trade system, at least not at launch. It's something that we really do want to add in because, as you say, it's an important dynamic to consider when trying to fully deconstruct the economic beneficiaries and political support for the institution of slavery. But it's one thing to represent that there is a slave trade going on through moving people around the world in response to laws and economic demand, and a whole other quagmire to actually represent people with price tags on them in an economics-focused game in a way that doesn't trivialize the topic. So I might go there eventually if we can find a good way to represent it, but for the moment we've accepted not being able to model this. Can a country outlaw slavery in its colonies but ban it in its incorporated states? The way it's modelled is via subject relationships, for example via Spain and Cuba. Slavery is outlawed in Spain but permitted in Cuba, which is a colonial subject of Spain, so just straight up yes. What roles can slave pops fill? I notice in the image they can be labourers, but why does it not show an option to replace them as farmers too? So, farmers in Victoria 3 are pops who have an expertise in growing crops, caring for cattle, and running a farm. Pops who do manual labour on a farm, harvesting and such, are either considered labourers or peasants. Both of these can be replaced by slaves in countries where this is allowed. But also to answer an adjacent question, this is moddable. Building types can decide which, if any, profession it can use slaves for. So, while this is something we likely won't do in vanilla, it should be possible to mod in that the clerk profession in urban centres could also be carried out by slaves, for example. Alright. Can slavery laws act as a casus belli for countries that have abolished it? For example, the UK invading a country to change their slave laws from slave trade to abolished. Yes. Perfect. Love it. Fantastic stuff. When we abolish slavery, would there be other consequences from this? Say, from the rich aristocrats, if you're not playing as the USA and won't have the Civil War, for example. There is a systemic fallout from banning slavery for any country in which landowners have gotten rich off it, and any country could potentially have a civil war around this issue. The American Civil War specifically has some more aspects to it, both in terms of flavor and mechanics, but a slavery-related civil war could happen anywhere or nowhere in a given playthrough. On serfdom, it's modelled as a labour law for two reasons. First, it should be possible to have both slavery and or serfdom. One should not be modelled as a progression of the other. It would make no sense for the United States to abolish legacy slavery in favour of serfdom, and then everybody clapped. The bus driver specifically clapped, yeah. But we also don't want to have 6 different slavery laws, debt slavery plus serfdom, slave trade plus serfdom, etc. On the other hand, serfdom is a progression in labour law. It's hard to imagine a country in which there are safety regulations to protect workers from being exploited in mines and factories while some people are inherently tied to land. Secondly, serfdom and slavery are two quite different beasts under our definitions. Serfs are peasants tied to the land, and that land is owned by the aristocrats. They have limited mobility and income opportunities and are forced to work hard for the benefit of their lord. This translates mechanically into a system where peasants have lower standard of living and cannot easily promote to fill new positions in an industrializing society. Slaves, meanwhile, are people that are considered legal property directly. They have zero mobility and no economic self-governance at all, with their needs supplied at the whim of their owners. They also differ in them that slaves must be discriminated populations, while peasants do not have to be. Mechanically, both systems are represented and they serve similar but fundamentally different roles. I think the thing to take away from this is just how, like, they're not belittling the subject. They're not, they're tackling the subject, right, head on, and they're still doing it, from the looks of it, from my opinion at least, they're doing it justice. It looks like it's going to work, like, it looks like it's going to work fairly realistically, right? That there are going to be people, or pops, countries, that are benefiting from slavery, and there are going to be countries where it obviously does not make sense to apply slavery. It looks like it is going to not be a pure form of absolute good to remove slavery, right? There are, if, say, the aristocracy is incredibly powerful in your country, getting rid of slaves would piss them way off, and yeah, that wouldn't be good if you pissed off the people who are propping you up as a country, and you'll probably end up in a civil war. Obviously, the human good, yes, getting rid of slavery is the human good thing to do. Economic good and human good are not always or even frequently aligned, though. So, I am very happy with the way that Paradox is treating this subject. Having just a modifier or just a pop type that, yeah, we'll get rid of it, click a button when we've got enough, parliamentary support to click a button to get rid of slavery, that's not good enough. And this seems like it is way more explored than it was in Vicky 2. And I'm really happy with the way they're presenting this. I really am. Can a debt slave be sold to somewhere with slave trade? In brief, and to also answer all the questions about who would be enslaved if I instituted slavery in my nation that started without it, this is exactly how slaves enter your country under slave trade, yes. Slaves only come into existence through debt slavery and the natural pop growth of slaves under the slave trade. If a country has no slaves and pass the slave trade law, they will start importing slaves from countries with debt slavery. Okay. Or, I assume, with slave trade as well. If you abolish slavery, how will the former slave pops act? will it be difficult for them to gather wealth and reach the standard of living levels of non-slave pops like what happened in the USA? So, they will likely remain discriminated status on account of their heritage, and they will not have accumulated the same level of qualifications as the rest of the pops in the country while they were slaves. So yes, they will almost certainly continue to be substantially worse off than other non-discriminated pops for a long time, especially until such time the country reforms their discrimination laws. Again, that's something that is very well modeled and true to history, right? Again, the big example here is America. America, you know, I don't know the year, 1880 something maybe. Slavery is abolished, right? Click of the fingers, Emancipation Proclamation, done. Slavery abolished. It wasn't fucking sunshine and rainbows, at all. After that, the black population of the USA didn't suddenly, you know, get completely integrated. Everyone was happy, economically wealthy. You know, it wasn't easy for the former slave profession people, right? There was massive amounts of discrimination, which you're still gonna get. There were maybe, you know, earlier on they said that the USA may have some more, flavor with the USA with their Civil War. So maybe afterwards there's going to be things like the Jim Crow laws coming into effect. And, like, yeah, it wasn't... I mean, it's still not perfect, and, you know, in many people's lifetime, including some people that work at Paradox, in the USA, the black population was still massively discriminated against, and the civil rights movement was going on. So, yeah, having it be that, oh yeah, you know, we got rid of slavery, click of the fingers, everything's fucking great, like it was in Victoria 2, that's not realistic. This seems way more realistic, and yeah, no, makes sense to me. I have a question about that last sentence. Does this also apply to debt slavery? Since debt slavery represents poor people in a society selling themselves into slavery, I'm not quite sure if it makes sense for them to need to be part of the particular population to become enslaved, or does that just mean once they become slaves, they become a discriminated population? No, you're right. Debt slavery can enslave anyone regardless of discrimination status. Discrimination matters for the importance of slaves under slave trade, which tends to lead to countries with slave trade having large quantities of slaves that are also discriminated. Okie dokie. Alright. How is abolishing slavery handled when it's enforced as a peace deal demand? On one hand, it feels wrong if you entered a civil war because you abolished it when having no choice, but on the other, it opens up the possibility of agreeing to abolish it in a peace deal just because you actually want to. It will anger all interest groups that would have been angered by abolishing it through normal legislative means, which may very well lead to a civil war to bring back slavery, where the country that forced them to abolish it might have to intervene to keep slavery banned. That's really cool. That's fun. Do countries with the slave trade law also accumulate slaves the way that countries with debt slavery laws do? Or are the two methods of gaining slaves exclusive? They are indeed exclusive. What determines when an enslaved pop moves from one state and building to another, be it domestically or internationally? How do I prevent all my own slaves from being shipped overseas? Or alternatively, how do I increase the number of slaves that are being imported? Buildings that has enough room to purchase slaves will first try to draw from the slave populations local to the state. If none qualify and the country has slave trade, they can cause a transfer of slave populations from a country with debt slavery in a region where they have an interest, which is something we'll talk about another time. Vicky 2 was quite strange in that slavery was limited to representing just the transatlantic slave trade, as far as I remember. You guys say you want to do this crime against humanity justice, but there's no mention of the slave trades of Africa and Asia. If these slaves are absent again, then you have not erased the suffering from history. I'm now trying to say this in the least disrespectful way as possible. Please clarify the situation. Indeed, if one was to pick up the worldwide abolitionism as a goal, it should be a truly massive project in Vicky 3. It should be much more than abolishing slavery in the USA and Brazil. I mean, this seems entirely like... This thing that you have not mentioned is clearly something that you actually are doing. And I'm going to accuse you of something that you have not said you were doing, just so I can get up on a soapbox and have a bit of a whinge. Sorry, shush. He's already mentioned that the Ottomans have slave trade law. There you go, there's one. If you believe that, you know, being asked, oh, do the Ottomans have slave trade? And him saying yes means that the Ottomans are the only one? Then you're just stupid. As mentioned a bit upstream, plenty of countries start with slave trade or debt slavery, far from just the USA and Brazil. Why just assume that it's just USA and Brazil, though? Like, why is this the assumption? Shut up, you fool. Anyway, moving on. Final question. What I find more interesting is that the economic consequences will contradict the statements in the Dev Diary. In the Dev Diary, it said that one can take advantage of slavery if one wants to be an agrarian state. But that is not true, and historically, it was not true either. A kind of symbiosis develops that can only be broken by political rejection. The use of slaves displaces the peasants into the cities, where to use them in the factories. I'm pretty sure that I will not be industrializing more slowly than with Sweden, for example, if I introduce slavery there. But I will get politically in relation to the introduction of a number of laws and a strong land-ruling class that will block a number of reforms for me. So he's not wrong. The statement in the Dev Diary does apply mostly to countries where a sizable part of the population are already slaves, and where there is plenty of arable land on which to expand plantations. If you already have a large workforce and you institute slavery, you're correct in that newly imported slaves would just occupy the menial jobs the domestic population would prefer not to anyway. Okay, dokes. Sweden, probably not a whole lot of arable land though, let's be honest. Yeah, no, interesting Dev Diary. For sure. There's a lot in there, and it is a heavy subject, and for me at least, I think they're doing it justice. It looks like they're doing it justice, which is awesome to see, really. I can't think of anything to complain about, right? It is adequately showing that certain countries start with slaves, what the benefits are to the individual populations that benefited, the downfall for the slaves, of course. It shows that they're struggling. It shows that there are going to be diplomatic actions that you can take if you wish to get rid of slavery. Diplomatic actions you can take if you wish to get slavery, gone in other countries. Like, it's really interesting, and I'm surprisingly pleased with how they're handling it. Yeah, good shit, and props to Paradox for this one. Good job. But anyway, what do you think? Are you happy with the way that this is implemented? Do you have any questions or complaints or any of the above? Let me know in the comment section below. I would very much like to hear your thoughts. So yeah, do that. If you want to, like button, that's also great. If you want to hit subscribe so you don't miss any Victoria 3 news or updates, that would be cool. I recently did a video on the images shown in the 3rd monthly update video that you can go and watch. And until next time, thank you very much for watching, and bye-bye.